Welcome back to The Shape of Knowing. This is episode 2 on theoretical structure. My name is Jenny, and a little bit about myself. I am about to graduate with my BA in psychology. I am working on a student designed independent study called Metaphor, Language, and Theoretical Structure. This podcast is about me talking through a few things before I actually write my real paper. I don't have everything figured out, so I'm just trying to figure things out yet. But first, I want to say something that is very personal and very hard for me to say out loud outside of some very true people in my life. With my friends' feedback, here's what came to mind to say about why I'm doing this podcast. So I suddenly became fearful that if I was asked how I came to even say these complex things, and so I sat down in front of my computer and I watched myself visually in my head say out loud as to what I would say, and this is what I typed out. I've been told my entire life that I have believed in the wrong things by different people, different times, different ages, through different means. And the beliefs that I was told were wrong did not always have to be whole. They told me that I had half a belief wrong or a small bit, or the language I used was incorrect to what I was trying to explain to them. And they told me to try harder. So I love education because I felt that learning made us all do something better, to reach for a believing that could do something helpful in a more meaningful way, and to communicate in the same language that all people understood equally, and where misunderstanding would be seen vividly and then aligned more correctly, instead of where I believe we are today. And this is just a small reason as to why I began questioning the structure of things through the curriculum throughout my entire college education of the past 15 years. And what a beautiful, hopeful place I get to be able to say such things. Now, on today's episode, I want to talk about theoretical structure. And what I want to know is, what is a theory made from? Not only what does a theory claim, not only what evidence does it use, but what gives a theory its shape? What language does it inherit? What metaphor did it receive before it knew it was receiving one? What model did it borrow? What did that borrowed model teach the theory to see? What did that borrowed model make harder to recognize? That is the question inside of my SDIS this summer. And I want to be clear too. I'm not writing about metaphor because I think metaphor may be one of the ways theoretical structure begins. And theory is not just a pile of facts. A theory has shape, it has assumptions, it has rules, preferred questions, language. It has language it resists. It has a way of sorting what counts as evidence and what gets pushed aside as distraction. A theory teaches people how to look. And once a theory teaches people how to look, it also teaches them what kind of thing they are looking for. That is already language, and that is already structure. That is already metaphor doing work under that surface. So the question for this episode is not, do theories use metaphor? Because of course they do. The question is, how does metaphor become theoretical structure? That is where Max Black comes in. Black does not treat metaphor as just decoration. He argues against the simple idea that metaphor is substitution. A metaphor is not just one word standing in for another word. It's not a fancy synonym. Black talks about metaphor through interaction, through implication, through systems. He uses the phrase system of associated commonplaces. And I want to slow this down. A metaphor does not arrive empty. Think of a suitcase that has stuff in it. A metaphor is the suitcase, and the stuff is, well, it arrives with the field around it. associations, expectations, prior uses, cultural habits, social reflexes, shared assumptions, old meanings, ordinary beliefs people may not hear themselves even carrying. So when a metaphor enters a theory, it does not enter as just a word, it enters as a structure. And that's just the first piece. The second piece comes from Black's work on models. And Black writes that the theoretical models, the heart of this method consists of talking in a certain way. Man, do I love that line, because that is exactly where I'm working. A theory is not only what it claims, a theory is also how it talks. The language of theory does not stand off to the side while the real thinking happens. The language organizes the thinking. It tells the field what can be named. It tells the field what can be asked. It tells the field what sounds precise. It tells the field what sounds irrelevant. It tells the field what kind of answer will be accepted. And that's just not like a surface language. That's structural language. If a theory depends on a model, and the model depends on talking in a certain way, then the theory is already shaped by language. Language as method, language as access and arrangement, language as system of attention. That is why theoretical structure cannot be separated from metaphor as easily as people want it to be. We build theories, we use language, we borrow models, we reach from what we understand toward what we do not yet understand. Not yet. What reaching often happens through metaphor. Lecoff and Johnson give me the next piece. They argue that metaphor is not just in language, but in thought and action. That sentence is one of the stones of the foundation of my SDIS. Because if metaphor is in thought and action, then metaphor is not sitting outside theory as a decoration. It is already inside how theory can form. It is already inside how people conceptualize. It is already inside how a field learns to organize a problem. So when psychology says the mind processes information, that is not a neutral word. When psychology says a person is regulated or dysregulated, that's not neutral wording. Or when medicine says the body is fighting illness. And when AI researchers say a system learns or attends or reasons, that is not just neutral. These words are not empty. They have source domains, histories, structures. They bring a way of thinking with them. And this is where my paper starts pushing beyond the summary. Because Lakoff and Johnson talk about the partial nature of metaphorical structuring. I understand what they are saying. When we say theories are buildings, we use certain parts of the building domain. We talk about foundations, framework, support, construction, collapse, weak foundation, strong framework, a theory that falls apart. Yet we do not usually talk about the theory's plumbing or the attic or the theory's insulation or the theory's electrical code or the contractor who disappeared halfway through in the job and left everyone else with the mess. And that actually could be its own chapter on theoretical structure. So yes, I understand the idea that not every part of the source's domain becomes conventionally active in the target domain, but I'm not convinced that the metaphor itself is partial. I think the receiver is partial. The metaphor remains whole. The source domain remains whole. The implication field remains whole. The receiving discipline activates part of it, uses part of it, formalizes part of it, makes part of it respectable, turns part of it into theory, but the rest does not just evaporate. It does not vanish because the field did not invite it to the meeting, or it remains latent. It's unexamined, suppressed, available. It can return later as contradiction, as confusion, as an exception, as a place where the theory starts to strain. That is the distinction I need from my paper, not partial metaphor, selective reception, or selective activation. The metaphor is whole, the receiving field is partial. And I want to say very clear here, because this is not just a technical disagreement. A word is not an empty shell. A metaphor is not an empty shell. A discipline cannot borrow language and pretend the history stayed outside. For example, if someone used a racist word and said, I'm only using the shell of the word, not the history, we would know that is absolute nonsense. The history is not detachable. The word has already lived a life. It has already carried force. It has already arranged people. It has already done work in the world. So no, you do not get to use the shell and pretend the structure did not come with it. That same logic applies to metaphor. A discipline can say, we only mean this technically. Okay, but the term still came from somewhere. The metaphor still has a source domain. The structure still has ancestry. Think about that. The implication field still exists. The receiving field may activate only the technical part, but that does not sterilize the rest. Now think about the mind as machine. That is the main example I want to use because it sits right inside of psychology, cognitive science, and eventually AI. We say the mind processes information. We talk about input and output. We talk about mental mechanisms, storage, wiring, feedback, malfunction, repair. Some of this language is very, very useful. And I'm not pretending that it's not, because it is. It helps researchers organize questions. It helps clinicians describe patterns. It helps students understand cognition. It gives us something to grasp on and something difficult to observe directly. But machine does not come empty. Machine brings function, parts, efficiency, operation, control, breakdown, repair, predictability, design. A machine is not a neutral object waiting to be borrowed. It is a whole domain of relations. So when mind is understood through machine, the receiving discipline may activate processing, storage, input, output, mechanism, feedback, but the broader machine field still remains present. And then I start asking, what happens to grief in a machine model? What happens to meaning, ambiguity, embodiment, culture? What happens to contradiction? What happens to a person as a living history? The machine metaphor may not carry those things very easily, but I do not want to say they left those things behind. The language is too passive, as if they were not left behind. They were not activated by the receiving structure. They were not given theoretical priority. They were not made visible by the model. And then later, when they returned, they may look like complications. They may look, but maybe they're not complications. Maybe they are unreceived structure pressing back against the theory. Maybe they're evidence that the metaphor was larger than the discipline allowed. So this is the core of the episode. I have a lot of questions. A theory can be built from selective reception. A field can take up part of a metaphor, stabilize it, train people inside it, and then forget that the larger implication field still exists. This is how metaphor can become theoretical structure. Not because metaphor magically becomes theory all at once. It's more like a process. A metaphor enters a field. A field activates part of it. It activated part becomes useful. The useful part becomes repeated. The repeated part becomes technical. Technical part becomes ordinary. That ordinary part stops sounding metaphorical. Eventually, people call it theory. But under the theory, the transfer is still there. The technical term, the source domain, is still there. The clearer definition, the metaphor still has ancestry. This is why I do not trust theoretical language that refuses to show where it came from. I do not trust a theory that acts like its vocabulary has no history. I do not trust a discipline that borrows terms and then pretends the borrowing had no consequences. Because the consequences may be subtle, but they are not imaginary. They shape what can be noticed. They shape what can be asked. They shape what gets counted, and they shape what gets excluded. They shape what starts to sound obvious. And obvious is sometimes inherited structure that has stopped introducing itself. This is where my SDIS comes in, my metaphor, language, and theoretical structure paper, because those are not three separate topics for me. It's a process. Metaphor is one route of transfer. Language carries the transfer. Theory stabilizes the transfer, and the receiving discipline may forget the transfer even happened. That is the sequence I'm trying to trace in my paper. This is also why Black and Lakoff and Johnson are not just sources I'm citing. They're like conversational partners for me. Black gives me interaction. He gives me associated commonplaces, associated implications, transfer of implications, theoretical models as talking in a certain way, especially. Lakoff and Johnson give me metaphor and thought and action, systematicity, highlighting and hiding the idea that metaphor structures experience, the partial nature of metaphorical structuring. They help push me into the next question. If Lakoff and Johnson say metaphorical structuring is partial, I want to ask, partial for whom? Partial for where? Partial in the metaphor itself, or partial in the receiving system? Because those are not the same claim. If the metaphor itself is partial, then the unactivated parts can look absent. But if the receiving system is partial, then the unactivated parts are still present as a latent structure. That difference changes the research question. It means the work is not only asking what part of the metaphor transferred, the work is asking what did the receiving field activate? What did it suppress? What did it formalize? What did it call technical? What did it no longer hear as a metaphor? What remains in the implication field? And what happens when the field mistakes selective reception for complete understanding? That is a theory building question. That is not just a metaphor question. That is why I'm building vocabulary like selective reception, full implication field, assumption persistence, metaphorical literalization. These terms are not finished yet. They are still forming. I am building the words because I actually need them. Because the existing language gets close, but not all the way there. And I think that is what theory building is before it gets all cleaned up. It is not a finished marble statue. It's more like a workbench for me. I have my books open, my Post-its everywhere, terms that almost fit, sentences that have like sticky fingers and muddy boots. A good sentence hiding under 5 terrible chapters, or a thought that keeps running because it has not found a final structure yet. And then slowly I start to see the shape. So this is my conclusion for today. A theory is not only built from evidence. A theory is built from language. It's built from models, metaphors, and the selective reception of borrowed structure. That does not make theory false. It makes theory examinable. It means I ask where its language came from. I ask what source domain gave it shape. I ask what the field activated, what it suppressed, what became technical, an assumption, and what stopped sounding like a metaphor. Just think about it. Theory as borrowed structure stabilized into a field's way of knowing. Because sometimes theoretical structure is not simply describing knowledge. Sometimes theoretical structure is the shape knowledge is forced to take. And that's all for today. Thank you for watching. Until next time, this is Jen on The Shape of Knowing. Don't forget to subscribe for my next episodes. Thank you so much.